the eyes that wouldn't close. That's what the undertaker whispered upon first seeing them. In Briar Hollow, West Virginia, the Whitmore family bore a curse inscribed not in ancient texts, but within their very bloodline. A curse born from generations of isolation, desperation, and a love that should never have existed between those who shared the same grandmother. Deep in the heart of Appalachia, where the mountains fold into themselves like secrets kept too long, there existed a hollow so remote the county sheriff hadn't visited in 3 decades. Briar Hollow appeared on no official map. The winding dirt road leading there had long been swallowed by kudzu and oak roots, and the few outsiders who stumbled upon it left with stories they were too afraid to tell. In the spring of 1947, a young census worker named Harold Brennan made his way through those mountains. His task was simple: count every soul in Logan County. What he found in Briar Hollow would haunt him until his final breath in 1982, when he finally told his grandson the truth about the family with eyes that wouldn't close. The Whitmores had lived in that hollow since 1823, when Ezekiel Whitmore first claimed the land. He was a coal miner's son who wanted nothing more than to escape the dark tunnels that had swallowed his father and 2 brothers. He found peace in that isolated valley, married a woman named Martha from the neighboring county, and built a cabin from timber he felled himself. For the first generation, everything seemed normal. Ezekiel and Martha had 7 children who survived infancy. They farmed tobacco, raised hogs, and traded with the few travelers who passed through. But then the Civil War came, and with it a terror that would change the Whitmore family forever. In 1863, a group of Confederate deserters passed through Briar Hollow. They took what little food the family had, harmed 2 of the Whitmore daughters, and left the family with a deep, burning hatred for the outside world. That night, Ezekiel's eldest son, Jeremiah, made a vow. No Whitmore would ever trust an outsider again. No Whitmore would ever leave the hollow, and no Whitmore would ever marry outside the family. It was a vow born from trauma, from a desperate need to protect what remained. But it was a vow that would twist the Whitmore bloodline into something unrecognizable. The first generation of marriages between relatives happened quietly. Jeremiah married his first cousin Annabelle. His brother Thomas married Annabelle's sister Ruth. The family justified it with scripture, with necessity, with the simple logic that there was no one else. The hollow was too remote. The outside world was too dangerous. And so the bloodline began to fold in on itself. By 1890, the effects were becoming visible. Children were born with limbs curved in wrong directions. Some couldn't hear, others couldn't speak. And then there were the eyes. The Whitmore eyes had always been a striking pale blue, almost gray. But by the 3rd generation of intermarriage, something had changed. The muscles controlling the eyelids had weakened. When a Whitmore slept, their eyes remained partially open. And when they passed, those eyes stayed open entirely, staring at nothing and everything. The local doctor, a man named Samuel Hartley, visited the hollow exactly once in 1912. He was called because one of the Whitmore women was having difficulty with childbirth. What he witnessed there would lead him to write a detailed account in his personal journal, a document that wouldn't be discovered until his grandson donated his papers to a university archive in 1991. Dr. Hartley described a family of 37 individuals living in 5 adjacent cabins. He noted the physical characteristics that marked them as different: the pale eyes that never fully closed, the curved spines, the fingers bent at unusual angles. But what disturbed him most was the family structure itself. He wrote that he counted at least 4 generations living together, and that the marriages he could discern from conversation were all between relatives of varying degrees. The child he delivered that night was a boy named Elijah. The mother was a woman named Sarah Whitmore. The father, according to the family's own admission, was Sarah's uncle, a man named Cornelius. Dr. Hartley noted that Elijah was born with his eyes already open and unblinking. The baby survived, but the doctor left the hollow that night and never returned. Harold Brennan, our census worker, arrived at Briar Hollow on a Tuesday morning in May of 1947. He had been warned by the postmaster in Logan to skip the hollow entirely. The postmaster said the Whitmores kept to themselves and that no good would come from disturbing them. But Harold was young and determined to do his job completely. The first thing he noticed was the silence. In a hollow that should have been alive with bird song and insect hum, there was only the whisper of wind through pine trees. The second thing he noticed was the smell. It was sweet and heavy, like rotting flowers mixed with something he couldn't identify. The cabins appeared suddenly as he rounded a bend in the overgrown path. There were 7 of them now, arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing, and in that clearing Harold saw something that made him stop walking entirely. There were people sitting in rocking chairs on the porches of 3 of the cabins. They weren't moving. They weren't rocking. They were simply sitting, their pale eyes fixed on him without blinking. Harold counted 8 individuals visible from where he stood, and not one made any motion to greet him or challenge his presence. He called out a greeting. His voice echoed off the mountains and faded into nothing. One of the figures on the nearest porch slowly raised a hand. It was a woman, perhaps 60 years old, though the peculiar aging of the Whitmore face made it difficult to tell. Her hair was white and wild. Her dress was patched in a dozen places, and her eyes were the palest blue Harold had ever seen. She spoke, and her accent was so thick, so removed from standard English, that Harold had to ask her to repeat herself 3 times. She was inviting him to come closer. She said her name was Patience Whitmore and that she was the eldest woman of the hollow. What Harold learned over the next 3 hours would fill 17 pages of his census notes, pages later classified as confidential by the county clerk and sealed until 1997. Patience told him the Whitmore family had numbered over 90 members at its peak in 1922, but a sickness had swept through the hollow that year, a sickness the family believed was divine punishment for something one of them had done. 53 Whitmores perished in 3 months. Those who survived bore the marks of the illness in their already compromised bodies. Now, in 1947, only 23 Whitmores remained, and of those 23, Patience explained with a matter-of-factness that chilled Harold to his core, only 7 were capable of the physical labor needed to maintain the hollow. The others were too bent, too blind, too damaged by generations of intermarriage to contribute. Harold asked about the practice carefully, trying not to offend. Patience simply shrugged. She said that outsiders had brought nothing but misery to the hollow. She said the family had tried once to bring in new bloodlines. In 1898, a young woman from the next county had married into the family. She had lasted 4 months before fleeing in the night, and the child she left behind was raised as a full Whitmore, eventually marrying her half-brother. The family saw nothing wrong with their choices. They had been surviving in isolation for over a century. They had their own customs, their own faith, their own understanding of right and wrong. And they had their dead. That was when Patience showed Harold the family cemetery. It was behind the largest cabin on a gentle slope facing east toward the rising sun. There were over 200 markers there, some made of carved stone, others simple wooden crosses. But what made Harold's blood run cold was the row of 7 fresh graves at the far end. The earth on those graves was still dark and loose, and on each grave sat a small wooden box with a glass window. Patience explained that the Whitmores believed the dead needed to see their way to heaven. Because Whitmore eyes wouldn't close on their own, the family had developed a ritual. After a Whitmore passed, they would sit with the body for 3 days, keeping the eyes moist with wet cloths. Then they would bury the body, but place a small box containing the eyes above the grave so the soul could watch over the family. Harold asked if she meant actual eyes. Patience nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. She said the family had been doing it since 1870, when the first Whitmore was born with eyes that truly wouldn't close, even with weighted coins placed upon them. The young census worker finished his notes, thanked Patience for her time, and walked out of Briar Hollow on legs that felt disconnected from his body. He filed his report with the county. The report was read, marked confidential, and filed away. No action was taken. The Whitmores were harming no one but themselves. And in the mountain communities of Appalachia in 1947, that was considered a family's own business. But Harold Brennan never forgot those pale, unblinking eyes. He never forgot the small boxes on the graves, and he never forgot what Patience whispered to him as he left. She said the youngest generation was different. She said there were 4 children under the age of 10 in the hollow, all born from unions between siblings and close relatives. She said these children were special. Their eyes never closed, not even for a moment. They slept with their pale blue eyes wide open, watching dreams no outsider could imagine. And she said that one of those children, a boy named Isaiah, had told her something that made even Patience, born and raised in the hollow, afraid for the first time in her long life. Isaiah had told his grandmother he could see things other people couldn't. He said he could see the eyes in the boxes and that the eyes were watching back. 1952 brought the first outsiders to Briar Hollow in 5 years. They weren't census workers or doctors or curious travelers. They were researchers from a university in Virginia, sent to study the genetic conditions prevalent in isolated Appalachian communities. Their names were Dr. William Hayes and his assistant, a young woman named Eleanor Price. What they documented over 3 weeks of careful observation would eventually become the foundation for a landmark study on the effects of genetic isolation. But the personal journals of Eleanor Price, discovered in her estate sale in 2003, told a far more disturbing story than any academic paper could contain. Eleanor was 24 years old when she first set foot in Briar Hollow. She was a scientist trained to observe without judgment, to document without emotion. But from her first entry, dated September 14, 1952, it was clear the Hollow was testing her professional detachment. She wrote that the Whitmore family had been expecting them. Word had somehow traveled through the mountains that researchers were coming, and the family had prepared. The cabins were cleaner than Harold Brennan had described 5 years earlier. The family members who greeted them were dressed in their best patched clothing, and the cemetery was hidden behind a newly constructed fence that blocked the view of the small boxes on the graves. Dr. Hayes was interested primarily in the physical manifestations of the family's genetic conditions. He measured skulls and spines. He documented the curved fingers and the unusual dentition. He recorded the pale, unblinking eyes with his camera, creating a photographic record that would later be used in medical textbooks. But Eleanor was drawn to something else entirely. She was drawn to the children. There were 6 children in the Hollow in 1952, ranging in age from 3 to 12. The oldest was a girl named Mercy, born to a brother and sister who had themselves been born to close relatives. Mercy was 12 years old, but her body had the proportions of a child half her age. Her spine curved severely to the left, forcing her to walk with a shuffling gait. Her fingers were fused at the second joint, making it impossible for her to grip anything smaller than an apple. But Mercy's eyes were what haunted Eleanor. They were larger than normal, the pale blue irises surrounded by whites that seemed to glow in the dim light of the cabin. And they never closed. Not when Mercy laughed at something her younger brother said. Not when she concentrated on simple chores. Not even when she slept. Eleanor asked Mercy's mother, a woman named Ruth, who was also Mercy's aunt, about the child's sleep habits. Ruth explained that all the children of the current generation slept with their eyes open. It had caused problems at first, she said. The parents couldn't tell if the children were awake or asleep, but they had learned to read other signs, the breathing pattern, the subtle relaxation of the twisted limbs, the way the unblinking eyes would go slightly unfocused when dreams came. The youngest child was a boy named Samuel, just 3 years old. Samuel was the child of 2 siblings, who were themselves the children of siblings. His genetic heritage was so intertwined that Dr. Hayes spent an entire day trying to draw a family tree that accurately represented his ancestry. The resulting diagram looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. Samuel couldn't walk. His legs had formed incorrectly in the womb, curving backward at the knee. He couldn't speak more than a few words, though the family insisted he understood everything said around him. And his eyes, those impossibly pale eyes, tracked every movement in the room with an intensity that made Eleanor uncomfortable. But it was the middle child, the boy Isaiah, who had frightened old Patience 5 years earlier, who became the focus of Eleanor's journal entries. Isaiah was now 12 years old, the same age as Mercy, though they were not twins. His mother had died giving birth to him, and he had been raised collectively by the women of the Hollow. His father was unknown, though, given the family's customs, he was certainly a close relative. Unlike the other children, Isaiah could move freely. His spine was straight, his limbs were proportional, and his fingers worked normally. If not for his eyes, he might have passed for a child from any mountain community in Appalachia. But those eyes marked him as unmistakably Whitmore. They were the palest blue Eleanor had ever seen, almost white, and they never closed, not even to blink. Isaiah was also the only member of the family who seemed genuinely curious about the outside world. He asked Eleanor questions constantly. He wanted to know about cities, about cars, about the university where she studied. He wanted to know if other families had eyes that wouldn't close. And when Eleanor said no, he seemed genuinely surprised. On the 8th day of their stay, Isaiah took Eleanor to see something he said he had never shown an outsider. He led her up a narrow path that wound behind the cemetery, past the fence that hid the grave boxes, to a small cave carved into the hillside. Inside the cave, lit by a single oil lamp, were hundreds of small glass jars arranged on wooden shelves. Each jar contained a pale, cloudy liquid. And floating in that liquid, Eleanor realized with dawning horror, were eyes. Isaiah explained that this was the family's true cemetery. The bodies were buried in the ground, but the eyes were preserved here in the cave so they could continue to watch over the hollow. He said that every Whitmore since 1870 had their eyes removed after passing and placed in these jars. He said the family believed that as long as the eyes remained, the souls of the dead would protect the living. Eleanor asked who performed the removal. Isaiah said it was the eldest woman's duty. Currently that was Patience. Before her it had been her mother. Before that her grandmother. The knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter, along with the herbs used to preserve the organs and the prayers spoken over each jar. Then Isaiah said something Eleanor would think about for the rest of her life. He said he could hear the eyes whispering sometimes, late at night when the hollow was silent. He said they told him things about the family, about the past, about what was coming. And he said they had told him about Eleanor before she arrived. They had described her exactly. Her brown hair, her green eyes, the small birthmark on her left wrist. Eleanor didn't believe him. She couldn't believe him. She was a scientist. But when she looked down at her left wrist at the small brown birthmark she had never told anyone about, she felt a fear that had no rational explanation. Dr. Hayes completed his research after 3 weeks. He documented everything with clinical precision, the physical conditions, the family structure, the degree of genetic similarity between members. His paper, published in 1954, would be cited in medical literature for decades. It used careful academic language to describe what he had found. It made no mention of the cave. Eleanor had never told him about it. But Eleanor's journal told a different story. In her final entry from Briar Hollow, dated October 5, 1952, she wrote that she had returned to the cave alone on their last night. She had gone to prove to herself that there was nothing supernatural about the jars, nothing mysterious about the eyes. She wrote that she had stood in that cave surrounded by hundreds of floating organs, and she had felt watched. Not metaphorically watched, actually watched. Every jar seemed to be looking at her, tracking her movements, seeing her in ways that eyes and bodies never could. And then, she wrote, one of the jars had fallen from its shelf. It had shattered on the stone floor, spilling its contents at her feet. The eye had rolled to a stop against her shoe, its pale iris facing upward, and it had blinked. Eleanor ran from that cave and never returned. She and Dr. Hayes left Briar Hollow the next morning. She finished her degree, became a professor, and spent her career studying genetics from the safety of a laboratory. She never went back to Appalachia, and she never told anyone about what she had seen in that cave. But in her journal, in shaking handwriting that looked nothing like her normally precise script, she had written a final observation. She wrote that as they drove away from the hollow, she had looked back one last time, and standing on the ridge above the family cemetery, watching them leave with unblinking eyes, was a row of children. 6 children standing perfectly still, their pale eyes tracking the departing car until it disappeared around a bend in the mountain road. The children who never blinked had watched her leave. And Eleanor spent the rest of her life wondering if those eyes were still watching, even now, even from hundreds of miles away. In 1968, the state of West Virginia launched a program to provide medical care to isolated mountain communities. It was called the Mountain Health Initiative, designed to bring basic health care to families who had never seen a doctor, never received a vaccination, never had a professional examine their children. Dr. Margaret Chin was 31 years old when she volunteered for the program. She was born in San Francisco, educated at Johns Hopkins, and had spent 3 years working in a busy urban hospital. She thought she had seen everything. She thought nothing could surprise her. Briar Hollow proved her wrong. The hollow wasn't on the official list of communities to visit. The program administrators had looked at the old census records, seen the note marked confidential, and decided to skip it. But Margaret heard stories from other doctors in the program. Stories about a family in Logan County with eyes that never closed. Stories about a hollow where the dead watched the living. She went looking for Briar Hollow on a Saturday in October. She told no one where she was going. She simply loaded her medical bag into her car and drove into the mountains, following directions pieced together from old maps and local gossip. What she found was a hollow in decline. 3 of the 7 cabins had collapsed, their roofs fallen in, their walls rotting. The others were barely standing, their porches sagging, their windows covered with oiled paper instead of glass. And the people who emerged to greet her were the most medically compromised individuals Margaret had ever encountered. There were only 14 Whitmores left in 1968. The oldest was Patience, now in her 80s, bent nearly double by a curved spine, but still sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued. The youngest was a girl named Hope, just 2 years old, the product of a union between Isaiah and his half-sister Mary. Isaiah was now 28 years old. He had become the unofficial leader of the hollow after his uncle Cornelius passed in 1963. He was still the healthiest of the family, still the most capable of doing physical labor, still the one who ventured out to trade with the occasional traveler who came near the hollow. But even Isaiah showed the effects of his heritage. His hands had begun to curve inward, the fingers bending at angles that made gripping tools difficult. His spine had started to twist, a subtle curve that would worsen with age. And his eyes, those impossibly pale eyes, had developed a milky film that clouded his vision, especially in bright light. Margaret spent 3 days in Briar Hollow, examining every member of the family. Her notes filled an entire notebook. She documented conditions that had no treatment, deformities that could only be managed, not cured. She saw children who would never walk, adults who would never see clearly, elders whose bodies had twisted into shapes that caused constant, unrelenting pain. But what affected her most deeply was not the physical conditions. It was the family's complete acceptance of their situation. They didn't see themselves as victims. They didn't see their isolation as a curse. They saw it as a choice made generations ago to protect themselves from a world that had shown them only cruelty. They saw their physical differences not as deformities, but as markers of their family identity. They saw their eyes that wouldn't close not as a medical condition, but as a gift that allowed them to watch over each other, even in sleep, even after passing. Margaret asked Patience about the practice of removing eyes after passing. The old woman didn't deny it. She said it was their way, had been their way for almost a century, and would be their way until the last Whitmore drew their final breath. Then Patience said something Margaret would record in her official report, the only mention of the family's unusual burial customs in any government document. Patience said the eyes were the family's true history. Every generation, every birth, every union was recorded not in writing, but in those jars in the cave. A Whitmore who knew how to read the eyes could trace the entire family tree simply by walking among the shelves. The color of the iris showed which branch of the family. The size showed the generation. The cloudiness showed how many generations of intermarriage had produced that individual. Margaret asked to see the cave. Patience refused. She said outsiders had no business looking at Whitmore history. She said the eyes were private family matters and that Margaret had already seen more than any outsider should. But Isaiah overruled his grandmother. He said that Margaret was a doctor, that she was trying to help, and that maybe if she understood the family's history, she could help better. So, for the second time in the Hollow's history, an outsider entered the Cave of Eyes. Margaret's description in her notebook was clinical, detached, the words of a scientist trying to process something beyond her experience. She wrote that there were approximately 300 jars in the cave, arranged chronologically on shelves lining both walls. She wrote that each jar was labeled with a name and date in faded ink. She wrote that the oldest jars dated to 1871, and the newest, she noticed with a chill, was dated just 3 months prior. Isaiah showed her how to read the family history in those jars. He pointed to eyes that belonged to siblings who had married, to relatives who had produced children together, to generations of intertwined bloodlines. He showed her how the eyes had changed over time, growing paler, larger, developing the distinctive characteristic that made them unable to close. And then he showed her the jar that had fallen when Eleanor Price visited 16 years earlier. It had been repaired, the eye placed in a new jar. But Isaiah said it was never quite the same. He said that I was restless now, always moving in its liquid, always looking for something. Margaret asked him what it was looking for. Isaiah said he didn't know, but he said it had belonged to his mother, the woman who had passed giving birth to him, and he said sometimes he thought she was looking for him, trying to see the son she had never held. Margaret left Briar Hollow with her notebook full and her heart heavy. She filed a report with the Mountain Health Initiative, recommending the family receive regular medical visits and that social services be notified about the children's conditions. She recommended the practice of removing eyes be investigated, though she carefully avoided language that would trigger a criminal investigation. Her report was received, read, and filed. No action was taken. West Virginia in 1968 had bigger problems than one isolated family with unusual customs. The Hollow was too remote, the family too suspicious of outsiders, the situation too complex for any easy intervention. Margaret returned to her urban hospital the following year. She specialized in pediatrics, spending her career helping children who had a chance at normal lives. She never forgot the children of Briar Hollow, the ones who would never walk or see clearly or close their eyes. And she never forgot what Isaiah whispered to her as she left the cave that day. He said his mother's eye had shown him something about Margaret, something about her future. He said the eye had shown him that Margaret would have 2 daughters of her own, that she would be happy, and that she would live a long life. He also said the eye had shown him Margaret would come back to the Hollow someday, not in her body, but in her blood. He said one of her descendants would find their way to Briar Hollow, drawn by something they couldn't explain, and that they would be the one to finally tell the family's story to the world. Margaret dismissed it as the fantasy of a troubled young man. She went on to have 2 daughters. She was happy. She lived a long life, passing in 2009 at the age of 72. And in 2015, her granddaughter, a young journalist named Sarah Chen, would begin researching isolated communities in Appalachia for a documentary project. She would find her grandmother's old notebook in a box of papers. She would read about Briar Hollow, and she would feel a pull toward those mountains she couldn't explain. The eyes, it seemed, had been right. The 1970s and 80s were cruel years for Briar Hollow. The family that had survived for over a century and a half began to diminish with terrifying speed. In 1971, a fever swept through the Hollow, taking 3 of the 14 remaining members. Patience, the matriarch who had guided the family for decades, was among them. She was buried with her eyes removed, the jars placed in the cave alongside her ancestors. In 1975, Isaiah's half-sister Mary passed in childbirth along with the baby. The loss devastated the Hollow. Mary had been one of the few women still capable of bearing children, and her passing meant the family's future was growing darker. By 1980, only 8 Whitmores remained in the Hollow. Isaiah, now 40, was showing the advanced effects of his genetic heritage. His spine had curved severely, his vision had deteriorated to near blindness, and his hands were so twisted he could barely hold a spoon. His daughter, Hope, now 14, had taken over most of the physical work of maintaining the cabins and tending the small garden that provided their food. Hope was different from the other children who had lived in the Hollow. She was smarter, more curious, more aware that the outside world existed and that the family's isolation couldn't last forever. She had taught herself to read from the few books in the cabins, ancient Bibles and almanacs left by generations past. She had listened to the battery-powered radio her father had traded for, hearing voices from a world she had never seen. And she had begun to ask questions no one in the Hollow wanted to answer. She asked why the family only married each other. She asked why her grandfather was also her uncle. She asked why her eyes wouldn't close when she slept, why her fingers curved, why her cousin Samuel couldn't walk even though he was now 23 years old. Isaiah tried to explain. He told her about the outsiders who had hurt the family in 1863. He told her about the vow that had been made, the promise to keep the bloodline pure, to protect the family from a cruel world. He told her the physical differences were marks of their uniqueness, signs they were Whitmores, connected to each other in ways outsiders could never understand. Hope listened. And then she asked a question Isaiah couldn't answer. She asked why, if the family's way was so good, there were so few of them left. She asked why, if their isolation protected them, so many had passed so young. She asked why the cave held hundreds of jars, but the hollow held only 8 living souls. Isaiah had no answer. He simply looked at his daughter with his clouded, unblinking eyes and said some questions were not meant to be answered. But Hope saw something in her father's face that day. She saw doubt. For the first time in his life, Isaiah Whitmore was questioning the choices his ancestors had made. In 1985, Hope made a decision that would change everything. She was 19 years old, strong enough to survive the journey, desperate enough to try. On a cold November morning, she walked out of Briar Hollow and didn't stop until she reached the town of Logan, 15 miles away. The people of Logan had heard stories about the Hollow family, but none had ever seen a Whitmore in person. When Hope walked into the general store with her pale, unblinking eyes and her curved fingers, the owner nearly called the sheriff. But Hope spoke calmly, clearly, in an accent that marked her as local despite her strange appearance. She said she needed help. She said her family was suffering. She said there were only 6 of them left now and that her father was too weak to care for them anymore. The store owner, a woman named Betty Crawford, would later tell reporters that something in Hope's unblinking gaze made it impossible to refuse her. She gave Hope food, blankets, and medicine. She drove her back to the edge of the hollow in her pickup truck, and she promised to check on the family every month. Betty kept that promise for 7 years. She watched as the Whitmore family continued to shrink. Samuel passed in 1987, his body finally giving out after 35 years of struggle. 2 elderly aunts followed in 1989, passing within days of each other. By 1992, only 4 Whitmores remained, Isaiah, Hope, and 2 cousins named Ruth and Ezra, who were too impaired to care for themselves. Isaiah passed that winter. He was 62 years old, blind, bent, and exhausted. Hope removed his eyes herself, following the instructions her grandmother Patience had passed down. She placed them in the cave on a shelf near his mother's jar so they could finally see each other. And then Hope did something no Whitmore had done in over a century. She left the hollow permanently. She took Ruth and Ezra to a care facility in Charleston, where they would live out their remaining years with professional medical attention. She sold the family's land to a conservation group that promised to preserve the hollow in its natural state. And she moved to Logan, taking a job at Betty Crawford's store, trying to build a life in a world she had only heard about on the radio. The cave remained sealed. Hope couldn't bring herself to destroy it, couldn't bear to dispose of her ancestors' eyes. She simply locked the entrance with a heavy wooden door and walked away. For 20 years, the hollow sat empty. The remaining cabins collapsed one by one. The garden was reclaimed by forest. The cemetery markers faded and fell. And the cave waited in darkness, 300 jars of eyes watching nothing, seeing everything. In 2015, Sarah Chen arrived in Logan, West Virginia. She was 28 years old, a documentary filmmaker from San Francisco, and she was searching for a story her grandmother had left behind. She had found Margaret Chen's notebook in a storage unit, filled with detailed observations about a family called the Whitmores. She had researched the hollow, found the old census records, read Eleanor Price's journals at the university archive. And she had felt drawn to this place in a way she couldn't explain, as if something was calling her to finish a story that had been waiting decades to be told. She found Hope Whitmore working at a hardware store in Logan. Hope was 49 now, her pale eyes still unblinking, but softer somehow, less haunted than in her youth. When Sarah introduced herself as Margaret Chen's granddaughter, Hope smiled for the first time in years. She said she had been expecting someone like Sarah. She said her father had told her long ago that a descendant of the kind doctor would come to tell their story. She hadn't believed him then. She believed him now. Over the following months, Hope told Sarah everything. She told her about the generations of isolation, about the choices made from fear and trauma, about the physical cost of keeping the bloodline closed. She told her about the eyes that wouldn't close, about the cave, about the ritual that had preserved her family's history in jars of cloudy liquid. And she took Sarah to the hollow one last time. The forest had nearly swallowed Briar Hollow. The cabins were gone, reduced to rotting timber and stone foundations. The cemetery was invisible beneath decades of fallen leaves. But the cave remained, its wooden door still standing, its contents undisturbed. Hope unlocked the door and led Sarah inside. The jars were still there, hundreds of them, arranged on shelves that had somehow survived the years. The eyes floated in their liquid, pale and clouded, watching the two women who stood among them. Sarah filmed everything. She documented each shelf, each jar, each name written in faded ink. She recorded Hope's voice as she identified her ancestors, tracing the family tree that had twisted in on itself for generations. And then Hope made a decision. She said it was time for the eyes to close. She said her family had watched over the hollow long enough. She said the living needed to let the departed rest. Over the following week, Hope and Sarah carefully removed each jar from the cave. They buried them in the old cemetery, placing each set of eyes with the body they had belonged to, finally reuniting what the Whitmore ritual had separated. The last jar Hope buried belonged to her father, Isaiah. She placed it in the earth above his grave, whispered a prayer she remembered from childhood, and covered it with dirt. When she stood up, her own pale eyes were wet with tears. It was the first time Sarah had seen her blink. Hope passed 3 years later, in 2018, at the age of 52. She was the last of the Whitmores, the final member of a family that had existed in Briar Hollow for nearly 200 years. She was buried in Logan in a regular cemetery with a simple stone marker. Her eyes closed naturally when she passed. For the first time in 5 generations, a Whitmore's eyes had closed on their own. Sarah Chen's documentary, titled The Eyes That Wouldn't Close, premiered at a film festival in 2019. It told the story of a family destroyed by isolation, by fear, by choices made in desperation that echoed through generations. It showed the physical cost of closed bloodlines, the emotional toll of separation from the world, the strange rituals that developed when a community had no one but themselves. But more than anything, it showed the humanity of the Whitmores. They were not monsters. They were not curiosities. They were people who had suffered, who had loved, who had tried to protect each other in the only way they knew how. The documentary ended with footage of the empty hollow, reclaimed by forest, returned to nature. Sarah's voice spoke over images of sunlight filtering through trees where cabins had once stood. She said that Briar Hollow was quiet now. The eyes that had watched for so long were finally at rest. The family that couldn't close their eyes had finally found peace. And somewhere in those mountains, where the wind whispers through pine trees and the morning mist clings to the valleys, the story of the Whitmores is becoming legend. A cautionary tale about isolation, a reminder of what happens when fear drives families to turn inward instead of reaching out. The eyes that wouldn't close had finally closed, and with them closed the last chapter of one of America's most hidden and heartbreaking family histories.